Scripture reading is from Romans 1, 16, 17. Romans chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith.
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you all out this morning. It's magic. See, I just made it appear again. Hold on, let me think again. You see, here we go. Oh, there it is. Very good. Well, let's just go back one. That's the one I really want to focus on right now. So. I had something profound I wanted to say, and now I don't know what it was. I'm glad to be back in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia. It was a long haul down there this time. We went to church Wednesday night in Laura's hometown there, where Dan Kessinger preaches at Mount Alto. He wasn't there, but her father was doing the teaching, and the girls got loose. They ran all around, and nobody was getting them. So they've never done that, but they do not like to sit in that car for 4.5 hours. That is a fact. But they didn't do too bad on the way down. They never slept. We haven't got much sleep. They just won't sleep in another bed. That's just all there is to it. So luckily Laura slept most of the day yesterday. And she drove home last night, and I slept on the way home. But I couldn't hardly sleep because they kept yelling. But they'll get better. I know they will. They're just we have them on such a tight schedule. They wake up the same time every day. They go to bed the same time every day. They eat the same stuff every day. I mean, we are. That's how it works. But. Like Steve said to me this morning, that usually works out most days. But when you go somewhere, it makes it a little rough. But I mean, we had fun, I guess. Laura couldn't find her horse till the last day, so I didn't have to ride that thing, which is always a good thing for me. But it's good to be around family this time of year. I got to catch up with that old friend, and really that's something that is enjoyable that we ought to do more of. But this morning, I was thinking, because one thing about not sleeping is it allowed me to work a little more on my lesson. And I was going to do a traditional New Year's lesson, which I still am. I mean, I want to encourage you, but I want to think about the new year and how we prioritize the gospel. And so we're taking up a very familiar verse, Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, which says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it is the power of God and the salvation to everyone that believeth." And then the caveat is to the Jew first. The reason it was to the Jew first is because when the church first began, this is how the message was to progress. But then also to the Greek. And as it has come down through the ages, we understand that the gospel is for all. And that we're not to be ashamed of it. I learned this word first at grade school. I remember I had a teacher, and I don't even know what us boys did, but she got very angry and slammed her book on the desk and looked at us and said, "Do you all have no shame?" And then she said, "You all ought to be ashamed." And I don't know why, but that's the first time I remember hearing that word. And I don't know that I understood it completely. So being ashamed is something that none of us like. I suppose we could look at a definition. The definition is to be embarrassed or guilty because of one's actions. characteristics, or associations. You ever done something that you're ashamed of because of some action you did? I was a spectator in one of our basketball games in high school, and the opposing team, the ball bounced into the bleachers where I was sitting, and I was to throw it back to the opposing team member, and I sort of went like this and then threw it, and he ended up getting hit in the head, and most of my home crowd buddies all cheered at that, but their parents were not very happy, and I tell you, I felt very ashamed. And I really didn't mean for it to go off that way, but it did. I remember coming in late one time, later than I should have been, and found my mother, who was worrying about me at the table. I remember feeling ashamed. Usually, a number of times throughout the day, Laura looks at me and I feel ashamed. Okay? So we understand being ashamed because of an accident we did, or just the way we are. Or, as the last part of this definition includes, our association. Oh, this has been a lesson that I think all of us need to learn as quick as we can. Bad company corrupts good mind. And if we are running with people that we ought not to run with, we can clearly end up bringing shame to a number of people. And this is one of those things that Paul says when it comes to the gospel, I'm not ashamed. A second definition of the word ashamed is to be reluctant to do something through fear or embarrassment or humiliation. And I think this really is the definition that Paul is focusing in on. There are times when you may feel ashamed of the gospel in the sense that there is fear attached to it because of some sort of embarrassment or humiliation. I was reading a few years back about a certain missionary we had to Japan, and he had taught his son to pray before every meal. And this was way back. This was actually before the Second World War and after the First World War. And many missionaries were going to Japan during that time. And at school, he went to school with all of these Japanese students, and before he would eat, he would put his hands together and pray. Well, the parents started calling the principal of that school, and they said there is a young sorcerer there who is doing magic and pronouncing hexes to his classmates before they eat every day. So the principal called him in, and he said, "Are you practicing magic?" The boy said, "No, sir. I'm a Christian, and I am praying to give God thanks before I eat." The principal bowed his head and started to cry. And he said, "I too am a Christian, but no one here knows it." Now, if you read the book a little farther, you find out that that man changed his life, became one of our best missionaries on the field, a Japanese native. But isn't it curious, sometimes we are just almost embarrassed by our faith. Well, the older we get, I suppose, the less we care about that. I've told you when I was working at the Case dealership in Cambridge, Ohio, it was just primarily a gigantic garage. And you had all these mechanics and folks that worked on these machines. And we would all set up in the second story at a long table, and we'd eat our lunch and complain about whatever was going on throughout the day. But before that, I would just simply bow my head and say a little prayer to myself. And one of the most curious things happened. After a while, the oldest man there, who sat next to me, he yelled at one of the other men for talking while I was praying, and he said, "Can't you see he's praying?" And then he says, "As a matter of fact, why don't you just pray for all of us?" So during my time there, it became a habit that I was able to pray before we ate with all of those men. It was time for the Christmas dinner that year, and we all got a crisp $100 bill and a Cabela's gift card. That's what we got, which I was very happy with. But for the first time in over 30 years, someone was called on to have a prayer before the meal. That someone was me. And by the way, all I simply did was bow my head every day before I before I ate. And actually, I've kind of gotten out of that habit because I don't have to do it in silence anymore. That's a very little thing, or at least you might think. What I noticed throughout that year is every time one of these men would have a problem in their life, I had a station where, matter of fact, what I did is I had this gigantic steamer. Now, this steamer was a building about the size of this little garage out here. And it would produce steam. And my job was to spray down all of that equipment and get all of that grease off of it. And real glamorous job. So every day I had to go in and sort of flush the system and do that. And generally, I'd be flushing that system, and some fellow would come out there. They'd usually go outside there to smoke or whatever, and take their break. And I could tell they wanted to talk about something serious by the way they entered the room. They didn't just barge in. They'd knock and put their head in a little bit. And I was able to talk with a lot of these folks. D.L. Moody said, lighthouses don't blow horns. They just shine. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to shine as much as we can. Try never to be ashamed. Try never to be in fear or humiliation over our Christianity. There's a lot of things that we can be ashamed of. I look back when I first started preaching, and I remember feeling almost ashamed to be telling older people how to live their life. I thought, boy, who am I up there on my soapbox? But as I've gone through the years, I want you to know that I'm not telling you how to do anything. I'm trying to share the gospel with you. And hopefully, maybe I have learned a little bit. And if you can learn a little bit from my life, then that's great. The fact of the matter is, we come together and we open up the Bible together. We study it, and we work our way through it. And we don't need to feel ashamed of that. I hope that we never do. The Christian shouldn't be ashamed of the gospel. Paul said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God. What is the gospel? I'm asked this question quite a bit. To give you just the most simple definition, it is the teaching or the revelation of Christ. This is the gospel. God revealing his will and wishes to mankind through his son Jesus. Being introduced to God. You remember Jesus said, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. The world knew very little about Jehovah. The fact of the matter is, he was elusive. When we think about the gospel, when we think about the revelation of Christ, we imagine that everybody knows something about it. But they don't. As a matter of fact, in the world, 91% of the world's population has heard of Coca-Cola. 74% have seen a Coca-Cola. 51% of all the people in the world have tasted Coca-Cola. But only 10% of the world's population really knows and understands the gospel of Christ. The Bible seems everywhere. It seems like it's everywhere. Any store you go into, you can find a Bible. But very few read it. We all know a little bit about it. We've all heard things, right? We all read things as we go along. We all see things on TV. But many times, these things aren't even what is in the Bible. And when we first begin to read the Bible, one of the most amazing things that happens is that you begin to learn a lot of things that you didn't know, and you begin to learn that a lot of the things you thought you knew are not in the Bible. And so as we read the Bible, it draws us closer to Christ. And the Christian doesn't need to be ashamed of the gospel of salvation. Now, salvation simply means the preservation or deliverance from some harm or ruin or loss. And so deliverance from sin and its consequences, believed by Christians to be brought about by faith in Christ. It is a light. I read about two kids, and I could empathize with this because when I was a kid, I went to one of these taverns taverns. I went to one of these caverns deep down in the ground. They were at Carlsbad Cavern, and it was a brother and his little sister. And they got to the bottom, and the tour guide, as they did in my circumstance, they always think it's funny to turn the lights on. Well, they're doing that to let you know how dark it really is underground. And the little sister began to cry because she was extremely frightened. And her brother said, "Don't cry. Somebody here knows how to turn the lights on." That's what the gospel is, folks. And that's our job as we go out into the world, to turn the lights on, right? My kids are fascinated with the flashlight button on my phone. I mean, they will gather around it and stare right into that bright light. All three of them, including Marley. The light attracts them, doesn't it? If you see a light far away, what do? You try to get close to investigate. You want to know. We need the light more than anything when it's the darkest. This is the message of the gospel. Light is available, even when darkness seems overwhelming. The servant of Christ is not ashamed to suffer for Christ. In 2 Timothy 1 and verse 22, Paul says, "For the which cause I also suffer these things." What was the which cause? Preaching. Preaching the gospel. He suffered because of it. Nevertheless, what does he say? "I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which he has committed unto me against that day." This is why he wasn't ashamed, because God is not a liar. When God gives a promise, you can bank on it. Hebrews says God is not a liar. Do we believe his words? Here, we don't have to be ashamed because we know God is there. He wasn't ashamed to suffer. Now, to suffer simply means to experience or be subjected to something bad or unpleasant. But when we are subjugated to something that is unpleasant, we learn to tolerate. I was talking to a young man yesterday who was going through trials, and we began to look back on our life, and I said, "Look how well you dealt with this one." You know, you probably remember having conversations with your friends when you were younger, and you didn't think you'd get past it. You got past it, and then worse things happened down the road. And what it does is it begins to condition you. Begins to condition you for the big fight. And you're more prepared. A few years back, there was a great drought that went through Florida. Maybe some of you believe it. It was in the 80s. And they were trying to come up with plants that were more resistant. And the orange tree was one of these. And what they learned during that time is you would have all these orange trees that were not bearing fruit because of the famine or the drought. And then right down the road, another farmer was able to grow oranges and they looked great. The reason was this. The farmer who was able to have oranges during this time of the year, when they were just saplings, these trees, he would deprive them of water for 2 weeks at a time. Did you know that? He deprived them of water for 2 weeks at a time, and when all his neighbors' trees were dead, these trees were strong and had oranges on them, man. And it simply happened because the plant, the tree, when it was young, suffered. And because it suffered, it became stronger. And it could tolerate hard times even more. Are we any different? We are going to suffer. The fact of the matter is, do we prepare for it? Do we learn from these things? Or do we crumble? Here then, we learn that with Christ, all things are possible. Don't we believe that verse that says, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me"? And so he rejoiced because of suffering. Now then, God is not ashamed to be called the believer's God. In Hebrews 11:16, the Bible says, "But now they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly. Wherefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he hath prepared for them a city." Aren't you glad that God isn't ashamed to be called your God? I read somewhere that there are at least 950 different names for God. 950 different names. One poet said it this way: "I was regretting the past and fearing the future. Suddenly my Lord was speaking. My name is I am." He paused. I waited. He continued. When you live in the past with its mistakes and regrets, it is hard. I'm not there. My name is not I was. When you live in the future with its problems and fears, it is hard. I am not there. My name is not I will be. When you live in the moment, it isn't hard. I am here. My name is I am. If you've ever wondered why God told Moses that his name was I am that I am, it was because he wanted Moses to know that even though he was sending him to do something that would be the hardest thing in his life, he was there. He didn't have to simply rely on an experience in the desert. He didn't have to go alone because God was going with him. And when we suffer, we do not suffer alone because Christ suffers with us. When we rejoice and blessings come our way, Christ is rejoicing. When we are saved, angels and all the host of heaven rejoice. He's not ashamed to be called our God. He has prepared a city for us. In John 14, he says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. And I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." When Marley got out of the truck with me this morning here at church, he said, "I think Jesus is coming back again today." I said, "You think so?" And then I had to tell him, "Get out of the car there, little Nostradamus." I don't know if his prognosis is going to be right on. I wouldn't mind it, though, if the trumpet blew right now. He wants Jesus to come back because he knows he's got a lot of family living there with him. And he's wanting to go see them. He said, "They're waiting on me." I had to give him a hug. How touching. The child understands these things. He says, "I'm coming back." And when he comes back, he says, "I'll take you with me. And in my Father's house are many mansions." The word literally means rooms. Now this is hard for me to relate to. We took off and went down, stayed with my mother-in-law. And, you wonder if there's enough room. Because we need extra rooms when we go. But there was room enough. My mother's got plenty of room in her house. Guests are a funny thing, aren't they? Ben Franklin said, "Guests are like fish. After 3 days, they start to stink." Praise him that he doesn't feel that way, because he wants me to spend all eternity with him. Christ is not ashamed to call his saints brethren. In Hebrews 2 and verse 11, "For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one, for which cause he is not ashamed to call them brethren." He calls us brethren. Brethren. Being ashamed of the gospel is something that is terrible. We came back up through Parkersburg. There's an island down there Blennerhassett Island. You all know where I'm talking about? Have any of you ever been there? Laura's too cheap, so she won't take me, but I'd like to go one of these days. It's got a lot of history. The reason I haven't gone is simply because the big mansion that's over there is not the real mansion. The real mansion burned down in 1812, and they put up a new one. I don't know what it is, but it just never has the same effect on me if it's not the real place. This is why I hesitate to go to Williamsburg. You know, you go to Williamsburg and all those colonial homes, none of them are colonial. They've all been remade. But, as I say, it is a good history lesson. But Blennerhassett Island is famous for a few things, but what it's most famous for is treason. Many of you probably know the name Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was a vice president, but that's not why you know him. You know him because he shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel, right? That's the most famous duel in American history. And by the way, after that duel happened, Burr thought that everything would be fine, but the nation did not like that. And most people called him a murderer. He ended up losing his fortune, and he came up with a scheme. And I'm not exactly sure what the scheme is. As a matter of fact, history doesn't know for sure either. But there was a family on that island, a very wealthy family that came over and bought the island and built a mansion there. Their names were Blennerhassett. And they got this idea that they were going to start a new empire in Mexico because, you know, in the early 1800s, we had acquired from France the Louisiana Purchase, which went way out there. But the Mexican folks still owned Mexico. And so there was this scheme that was hatched, and an artillery began. And it all happened under the guise of regular trade. At night, stuff would be shipped over to that island, and people started asking the question, why are all these boats going there at night, and what are they taking? And as it is in a small community, people got to looking, and then the feds were called in. I don't know that we had feds at that time, but he's hauled off to court, and he is not found guilty of treason by the courts. But he is found guilty in the papers and in popular opinion. It's a curious thing about him. When he was young, he was attending Princeton, and there were great revivals that were going on during that time. And the preacher was preaching, and he called for the people to come forward and be saved. Now, this was curious because he heard the voice say it, and he turned around and came back and sat in his seat and said, boys, I was just fooling. I was just fooling. Burr was a great vice president. He did very well when he was in politics. It would have been amazing to see what kind of man he could have became had he truly dedicated his life to Christ that day instead of being ashamed of it. I was just fooling. I know so many people that live on the borderland. You know what I'm talking about? That land out there where they're so close to the kingdom of Christ, it's amazing they don't just fall in it. I've known people who have attended church their entire life and died having attended church and never made one commitment to Christ. Men whose wives have drug them there for 50 years. It's amazing to me, the people that live on the borderland, who wait. But then I'm reminded of the Bible, of the one who says, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. I think I told you a while back, one of the things old preachers used to talk about was the wiles of the devil. We read that in the Bible. One preacher said, the greatest wile the devil has in his quiver is wait. Wait a while. There needs to be an urgency to this, folks. We must never be ashamed of the gospel because Christ is not ashamed of us. This morning, the invitation is yours. Won't you come as we stand and sing?